Hi, my name's Izzy, and I am a 16-year-old disabled activist from Minnesota. I'm a member of the Disabled Caucus, and I have both physical and mental disabilities that severely impact my life and my activism, which is why I am so passionate about this issue, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, my name is Alexia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also part of the Disability Caucus, and I'm from Austin, Texas.
Hi, my name's Doran. I use she, her pronouns. I am 18 and I am from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and I am also a part of the Disability Caucus.
So today we're going to be talking about how the climate crisis intersects with people with disabilities by answering a series of questions. We talked to a bunch of youth climate activists, and these are the questions they have.
What is the history of disability activism?
So the disability movement has a long history that is not very well known. During the 1960s and 70s, movements like the Civil Rights Movement and anti-war movement brought sweeping changes across the country. The disability movement did as well. However, the struggles and actions of disabled activists are not taught in schools. There were broad intersections with other movements at the time, such as crossover with the such as the Black Rights Movement and the Gay Liberation Movement. The radical and courageous actions of disabled activists like Kitty Cone, Edward V. Roberts, and Judith Heumann brought about substantial change. The 504 sit-in in 1977 further proves that radical and direct action is the only way towards progress. Activists staged a sit-in occupying the San Francisco Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, demanding that they add regulations to Section 504, which stated that no otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States shall solely on the basis of his handicap be excluded from the participation, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Because there were no regulations, this law was not enforced at all. So the 504 sit-in and occupied the Hugh building for 25 days. This is still the longest sit-in at a federal building to date, yet most people have never heard of it. This inspired disabled activists across the nation to join the fight and demand change, staging protests. And soon regulations were added and their demands were met. That is just one story of disabled activism that has been silenced for far too long. Okay, now I have a question. How are people with the disabilities affected in the climate crisis?
So one of the biggest ways that people with disabilities are affected in the climate crisis is through natural disasters, which are increased in amount and severity by the climate crisis. So every disability is different, which means every person is impacted in a different way. But to name a few, people who have are completely reliant or just reliant for quality of life on medication may have their access to that medication interrupted by a natural disaster. And people who have mobility issues simply may not even be able to get on a bus or something to evacuate. In fact, according to the UN, a woman died in Hurricane Katrina in her own home because she couldn't get out of bed to evacuate. This is not acceptable, and there's so many ways that this can be prevented. Another big way is that extreme weather, especially extreme heat, can cause people with disabilities to be hurt and affected disproportionately, especially people who are working class and are unable to afford things like air conditioning.
I also wanted to add that this very much connects with racism, imperialism, and colonialism because people with disabilities from the global south are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, which is actually predominantly caused by people from the global north. And the continuous exploitation by multinational corporations and imperial foreign policy continues to threaten the lives of people with disabilities from the global south. The US government and secretaries of states definitely have blood on their hands. The next question is, what is it like being a disabled activist?
It can be very difficult to be a disabled activist because it can definitely feel like I have to work 3 to 10 times harder or more than people who are able-bodied. A big part of activism is writing or planning or walking at marches, and I can't always do that. And so it can be really difficult, and I feel like I'm constantly just catching up to everyone else.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's so much fatigue and stress that comes with being disabled that you can't let get to you as much having to be a disabled activist. And from the other end of the spectrum, as someone who has some learning disabilities, it can be so hard to focus. I don't know if you've heard, but I sometimes struggle to speak or connect my words or find the right words. So it's hard to be as effective without pushing like 10 times harder.
And echoing what you guys just said, people with disabilities are constantly being excluded. Organizations, especially big and corporate organizations, when they list out frontline communities, people with disabilities are always excluded and therefore silenced. The constant exclusion and ignoring of people with disabilities puts them in an even more vulnerable situation that leads to death. Additionally, activism is easily commodified, and corporations will capitalize on these narratives while ignoring marginalized communities' needs and fail to create any meaningful change. Activism can quickly turn into a performance where celebrities and other powerful individuals pretend to care about certain cause, but there's no actual radical change being created.
So, how can people and orgs be more inclusive?
It's pretty basic. It just really takes the minimum effort. Make sure that you include closed captioning, listen to your disabled activists, have interpreters and other accommodations so that disabled activists can be a part of the conversation and not left out.
Yeah, and one of the biggest ways is really having leaders, or at the bare minimum, hearing input from people who are disabled, because no one understands disabled issues more than those who are disabled.
Yeah, additionally, it's just very important to always include people with disabilities when you're listing out different marginalized communities. Additionally, capitalism goes beyond the constant exploitation of land and labor to accumulate capital, and it's also kind of infiltrated the fabric of society and kind of resulted in this mindset that we constantly have to be productive, and that's how we're valued. And that is actually very ableist to say, because that is saying that the more productive you can be, the more valuable you are to society. And in activism, it can feel like you constantly need to be doing things when that's not the case.
Okay, so how does mental health fit into this conversation?
Mental health fits into this conversation because mental health issues become a disability when it significantly interferes with the performance of major life activities, such as learning, working, and communication, among others. People with severe mental health issues are at risk because they need medication or intensive care to be able to survive on a day-to-day basis. And also, activism can just be very taxing and demanding, especially people with pre-existing issues. So it's very important to take care of people with disabilities that have mental health issues and make sure we check in on each other.
And to add on to that, the physical health issues and mental health issues are incredibly intertwined. When my depression gets worse, my physical symptoms gets worse. My physical symptoms can cause depression, and my depression can cause physical symptoms. So their disability is totally intertwined.
Yeah, so what are some solutions? So, guaranteeing access to appropriate, accessible transportation, assisting people with disabilities, their family, and support networks to stay connected through migration whenever possible. And that migration is not like family trip, that is forced migration due to a disaster. And access to healthcare for everyone, regardless of pre-existing conditions.
Ensure that there is accessible, temporary, and permanent housing along migration pathways and at destinations. Simply reinforcing existing human rights and disability rights and laws and policies can benefit climate migrants. Also, ensuring that human rights are not violated. Often with natural disasters, disabled people are forced to be institutionalized without their consent or the knowledge of their family or and or the knowledge of their family.
And the biggest thing to help is simply just listening to and including disabled activists.
Thank you for listening and watching this. Yay!
Woo!